The Nichols verdict and aftermath. Today, a federal judge rejected defense arguments that Terry Nichols should be spared a possible death sentence. Yesterday, the jury rendered a mixed verdict on charges Nichols helped Timothy McVeigh blow up the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. Jurors found Nichols guilty on 1 count of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and on 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter. They found him not guilty of using a weapon of mass destruction and of destruction by explosive. Now, more on the verdict, the trial, and the upcoming sentencing phase from 2 observers who periodically have joined us during both the Nichols and Timothy McVeigh trials. Tim Sullivan, senior correspondent for Court TV, and Dan Recht, former president of the Colorado Criminal Defense Bar and a practicing attorney in Denver. Dan Recht, how do you interpret the split verdict that they rendered?
Well, first of all, I interpret it as a huge victory for the defense. There's no question about this. I mean, from the beginning, the prosecution has wanted to get a death penalty against Mr. Nichols, and this makes it somewhat clear that they're not going to get that. So despite the public face they're putting on, I would suggest that they're pretty disappointed. And the defense, on the other hand, I would think is very happy, because Michael Tiger, from the day he took this case, his job has been to save the life of Terry Nichols, and it seems as though he's gone a long way down that road towards saving his life.
But the split verdict itself, what does that tell you about what the jurors decided?
I think the jurors were compromising. They clearly did not believe that Terry Nichols was as involved as Mr. McVeigh. And while it's a compromise, I don't think it's the verdicts are inconsistent. What they said is that Mr. Nichols was involved in a conspiracy to use or build a bomb at some point. And then at a later point, seemingly, he did some act that was involved in these people dying. But interestingly, they clearly said that he was not involved at the end, because they said, when they said that he wasn't guilty of first-degree murder, they were saying that Mr. Nichols did not intend for anybody to die, did not deliberate to have anybody die, did not mean to have anybody die, did not know that anybody was going to die. That's basically what involuntary manslaughter is. I mean, to give you a sense of what kind of crime it is, involuntary manslaughter by itself carries a maximum prison sentence of only 6 years.
Was Mike Tiger right? Has anyone ever been sentenced to death on, say, a conspiracy charge rather than on, say, first-degree murder?
Well, the history of the death penalty in our country since it was reinstituted back in the late 60s is that nobody has been executed except for first-degree murder. So not for anything else. And here, of course, Mr. Nichols was convicted of not first-degree murder, but manslaughter. Now, your question is, what about the conspiracy to build this weapon of mass destruction? That's never been tested by the Supreme Court, or never been tested in the Supreme Court, and so we don't know.
And explain that, just let me interrupt you for a minute, because this is a fairly new law. It's an anti-terrorism, federal anti-terrorism law.
Right. There are new laws out of the U.S. Congress that allow for the death penalty for some non-first-degree murder offenses, including this one. And so whether that is constitutional or not, to give somebody the death penalty for other than first-degree murder has yet to be tested in the Supreme Court.
What do you think was the biggest difference between these 2 cases, 2 trials?
I think the biggest difference was the amount of evidence between one and the other. I think what's important is to look at these 2 trials together and see what we have in our country is a jury system that really works. You have the McVeigh jury that said, look, we're convinced beyond any reasonable doubt that he did this, and they convicted him, and they said he should be put to death. And in this case, a jury looked at evidence with regard to Mr. Nichols and said, as they should have, look, we tried, we looked at the evidence, we followed what the judge said, and we have reasonable doubts with regard to whether it's first-degree murder and with regard to second-degree murder. So, and they didn't find him guilty of those. So when you look at a whole of these 2 trials, even though there's different verdicts, I think we are looking at a jury system that works very well in our country, and one that we as Americans should be very proud of.
Okay, well, thank you both very much, Tim and Dan.